Talk to me. Tess, I'm still trying to digest what we just witnessed. I understand there was a mastery boxing lesson from Shakur Stevenson, but this is the entertainment business. And I had a hard time at times actually standing woke, and watching the fight. Shakur needs to understand that he needs to take risks. I understand not getting hit, but taking risks is a necessary thing in this business.
Yeah, listen, good performance by Shakur. I mean, how can you complain about a shutout? I get the entertainment thing.
So Timothy Bradley says Shakur Stevenson's performance nearly put him to sleep, which is ironic coming from a fighter that was labeled as a boring fighter throughout his entire pro career. That's exactly right. When Timothy Bradley unified 140 with Alexander, the same people that's calling Shakur Stevenson boring today were the same people that called Timothy Bradley's performance ugly and boring against Alexander. In fact, Timothy Bradley has such of a bad reputation of being a boring fighter that other fighters use the boring excuse to avoid him. One fighter come to mind that Timothy Bradley was calling out heavy was Marquez, in which Marquez continued to respond to the critics of avoiding Timothy Bradley fight by stating that Timothy Bradley is a boring fighter, which is exactly why he do not want to fight him. Then fast forward more than a half a decade later, Timothy Bradley beat Manny Pacquiao in a controversial decision that was also labeled as a boring performance by Timothy Bradley, in which all of the backlash annoyed Timothy Bradley so much that caused Timothy Bradley on his next fight against Provodnikov to go toe-to-toe in order to please the fans, which he ended up with brain damage. This brother ended up punch drunk at the end of the fight. That's what it took for Timothy Bradley to end up getting the Marquez fight. It was coming off a bad performance where he was punch drunk, plus Timothy Bradley world title enticed Marquez in, since Marquez wanted to make history in order to be the first Mexican champion in 5 different divisions. But sadly for Marquez, he ended up losing, which explains why Marquez was avoiding the Timothy Bradley fight all along. It had nothing to do with being boring. All it was, skill, recognize skill. That's what it all comes down to. And trust me, Timothy Bradley know this better than I do. I only witnessed this. On the other hand, Timothy Bradley lived it. Therefore, it's so hypocritical for Timothy Bradley to call Shakur Stevenson, who's more of an exciting fighter than he was, a boring fighter, and he nearly put him to sleep. Timothy Bradley is repeating to a T the same racial critique on Shakur Stevenson that he himself received throughout his entire career. Have you guys noticed the pattern of Timothy Bradley always being overcritical of any black fighter? On the other hand, when it's a fighter on the hope list, it's the contrary. Let me explain. Have you guys ever heard Timothy Bradley say, Vasyl Lomachenko or Tyson Fury put him to sleep because they were so boring? That's a rhetorical question. Absolutely not. We all know what time it is. What's understood don't have to be explained. When Lomachenko fought Teofimo Lopez, for 6 rounds, Lomachenko landed 6 punches, which is equivalent of 1 punch per round. Lomachenko was losing every single round for 7 rounds. All he was doing was moving around, not taking any risk. So while Lomachenko was losing, putting on a stinking performance, why didn't Timothy Bradley say, Lomachenko is putting me to sleep, guys? Who needs NyQuil when you watching Lomachenko? Please bring me my coffee, Tessitore. Did Timothy Bradley say any of that? Of course not, since Lomachenko has the complexion for the connection to get the ultimate protection. He's free of any criticism. He's the Matrix. That's the only thing Timothy Bradley is allowed to say. In fact, when Lomachenko was doing absolutely nothing, fighting Teofimo Lopez, that's all Tessitore was calling Lomachenko, is the Matrix. Instead of covering the fight, all we heard was, just wait for Lomachenko to display his Matrix abilities. And we still waiting till this day, because all we saw was the Matrix without his special abilities. But again, why didn't Timothy Bradley keep the same energy with Lomachenko that he had for Shakur Stevenson last night? I'll tell you why. It's all about the yin and the yang. We see when Timothy Bradley is covering Tyson Fury versus Wallin, he never once said Tyson Fury is a boring fighter. He's having a boring performance. Mind you, Tyson Fury has a reputation of being boring. When he beat Klitschko, that was a boring performance. But you will never hear old media, Timothy Bradley, Mark Kriegel, or Tessitore call Tyson Fury boring. But Shakur Stevenson, on the other hand, even though he's coming off back-to-back exciting performances where he's getting knockouts and throwing 5 punches combos in the inside, all of a sudden, the moment Shakur fights a technical fight, displaying the sweet science in a beautiful fashion, hit and don't get hit, automatically they label him a boring fighter, forgetting about all of his previous performances. This is such a flashback to Pretty Boy Mayweather, because I remember like it was yesterday, when Floyd Mayweather was knocking out undefeated Corrales, Gotti, Indom, in fights of the year top of beatdown, even against Chop Chop, Ricky Hatton, so on and so forth. All these exciting performances Floyd Mayweather had at the top level, they still called him boring. If you don't believe me, when Pretty Boy became Money Mayweather and fought Ortiz a decade later, Larry Merchant said that the Ortiz fight was Floyd Mayweather's first exciting fight, but Floyd sabotaged the performance with a cheap shot.
An outstanding performance by Mayweather. He knew the flaws in Ortiz. He seized on them. He took some of Ortiz's good shots. For once, we can all say he was exciting in the ring as he has been outside the ring. Harold Letterman.
Mind you, it was Ortiz who headbutted Floyd illegally by literally jumping on Floyd with a headbutt. He thought Floyd Mayweather's head was a soccer ball, which Floyd Mayweather got his get back a few moments later, after the referee said fight. You have to protect yourself at all time, the referee said fight. Especially when Ortiz busted Floyd Mayweather's lips with his illegal move and hugged and apologized to Floyd 1,000,000 times before the referee said fight. That's beside the point. The point here, though, Larry had the audacity to say this was Floyd Mayweather's first exciting performance. When he called the Indom, Corrales, Hernandez, Chop Chop Corley, and Gotti fights, this just to prove, when you a fighter on the coincidental list, you damn if you do, damn if you don't. You have to do 10 times more just to get half of the credit. So when you hear them say, a boring fighter, that's another code word for the N-word fighter, because they will never call a fighter on the hope list boring. I don't care how they fight or how boring they are. Remember Willie Pep? They always brag about how he won a round without throwing a punch. But I can promise you, if Shakur Stevenson does it, they will call him the most boring fighter in history. With the facts being stated, when I dropped my recap on Shakur Stevenson last fight, a lot of people said Shakur is never going to be a pay-per-view star. But ironically, that's exactly what they said about Floyd, in which Floyd Mayweather turned out to be the biggest pay-per-view star of all time and the first billionaire in the sport of boxing. You see, these decaps will say anything but name their favorite fighter or a fighter that can beat Shakur. You never see them say, I want to see Oscar Valdez versus Shakur next, because they know Shakur will dog walk Oscar Valdez, and all of the decaf's favorite fighters. That's why they shook of Shakur. That's why they don't like Shakur, because he would literally beat the crap out of all of their favorite fighters. You think it's a coincidence they say Andre Ward, Demetrius Andrade are boring, but Caleb Plant is not? You think it's a coincidence they say Lara is boring, but Billy Joe Saunders is not? You think it's also a coincidence that Devin Haney is boring, Shakur is boring, but Lomachenko and Tyson Fury are not? I can go all day, all night with fighters that has parallel styles, but one being labeled boring and the other is not, all because of the yin and the yang, black and white, the coincidentalist and the hopeless. That's what it all comes down to. In our reality, Shakur is more exciting to watch than a Munguia, a Sean Porter, and fighters that aren't as sharp as him offensively and defensively, for multiple reasons. When Shakur lands a punch, it's more sharper and crispier than other fighters when they do the same, like Sean Porter and Munguia, etc., etc. Let me emphasize. For example, when you see Floyd Mayweather do a pull counter on Sugar Shane Mosley, every time Floyd Mayweather landed a right hand, it's so sharp and crispy that you get a reaction. That's what Shakur brings to the table. I can go down a list of fighters that can land the same Floyd Mayweather right hand, and it'd be so ugly that you won't get a reaction from the viewer or the crowd. See, people are amused by superheroes because they can do things that we can't do physically. Therefore, when you watch a fighter and he brings nothing special to the table, you can see a slugfest between two average fighters. You're going to enjoy it for the moment in time, but it's nothing you're going to glamour for in the long run, since you really didn't witness anything extraordinary. But when you see a fighter that's displaying matrix abilities, dodging punches like he's dodging bullets, and then coming back with his own counter punches, now that's impressive. Why? Because you, the viewer, can't do that physically. Like I said, people are amused by superheroes because they are superhuman. The Flash is not strong, but he's as fast as light. Superman can fly. He's strong as heck. Goku can always break his limits, which in boxing, that's what we call a second, third gear. What attracts people to superheroes is the same thing that attracts people to fighters: ability. That's what it all comes down to. You're not trying to listen to a rapper that you can come up with raps better than he can. The same thing applies to fighters. I'm not trying to watch a fighter that I can probably box better than he can, which is why the words boring and Shakur can't go in the same sentence, because watching Shakur is like watching a superhero perform. You hear people always say, when Floyd Mayweather was fighting, people only bought the pay-per-view because they want to see Floyd Mayweather lose. He's a boring fighter. Well, explain to me why Floyd Mayweather highlights and his fights on YouTube does more views than any other action fighter. If Floyd Mayweather is boring, why are people going back to watch his boring fights? Something is not adding up, unless he's more exciting than all of your favorite fighters. The real reason why you guys hate Floyd Mayweather is because he beat y'all favorite fighters, which is exactly why all of you decafs hate Shakur Stevenson today, because you guys know he will smash y'all favorite fighters. That's why you guys hate Shakur, Devin Haney, Floyd Mayweather, Andrade, Andre Ward, Terrence Crawford, and all of these fighters on the coincidental list. It's not a coincidence, because when Shakur displays zero flaws in the ring, they say he's too technical. He don't get the knockouts. On the other hand, when Deontay Wilder, all he gets is knockouts, they say he's not technical enough. But when Shakur and Floyd are too technical, then they hate technique. Like I said before, when you're on the coincidental list, you damn if you do, damn if you don't. The only thing that will satisfy old media is seeing these fighters on the coincidental list lose. So Shakur Stevenson, instead of apologizing, don't let them see you sweat. That's what they want to see. It's never about being boring. All you see on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube is highlights of fighters that's dodging punches like the Matrix. Highlights of defensive videos on social media is what get the most views. Ali, Floyd Mayweather, Roy Jones, and now Shakur and Devin Haney's turn. So it never been about being exciting. It's the contrary. They want to see Shakur Stevenson get hit because they personally don't like Shakur, since he don't have the complexion for the protection. On the other hand, when it comes to Timothy Bradley, I already told you guys where the roots of being a housemaid comes from. I went in depth on Timothy Bradley's influence of making his masters proud, which I'm gonna leave the link for that video in the comment section below. It was the recap of Shakur versus Jemiah with the facts being laid out. Drop your thoughts in the comment section below, subscribe below, and click on the notification bell to be continued on the next episode of Akhi, Akhi, TV. Peace, and I'm on to the next one.